I'll turn the headphones on. There we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Bear. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, that the land that we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Dene, and the Inuit as well, as the homeland of the Red River Métis. Additionally, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Worcestertown. And of course, we are gathered, and thank you all so much for being here for the sixth book in the Mighty Muskrats series from Michael Hutchinson, The Case of the Movie Mayhem. Let's give him a round of applause. And we're of course grateful to Second Story Press for publishing this book and for making this evening a possibility. So immediately following my introductions, we're going to go into a conversation portion of the evening, followed by a reading. And then if time permits, which they likely would, we'll open it up to questions. So if you do have a question, just let them percolate throughout the night. Then I'll pass this wireless microphone to you, just so that you're audible for the folks who are watching at home tonight. And then of course, following the conversation, I'll introduce how the signing portion will go. But now to introduce our hosts. Rosanna Deerchild has been storytelling for more than 20 years, currently as host of the CBC Radio 1's Unreserved, a show that shares Indigenous community, culture, and conversation. Rosanna has also developed and hosted This Place, a podcast series for CBC Books around the Indigenous anthology This Place, 150 Years Retold. Her debut poetry collection, This is a Small Northern Town, won the 2009 Aqua Books Lansdowne Prize for Poetry. Her second book, Calling Down the Sky, recently published in the 10th anniversary edition, is her mother's residential school survivor story. Her most recent collection, She Falls Again, was published in fall of 2024. A Cree from Opapanapun, Cree Nation, at South Indian Lake in northern Manitoba, Rosanna now lives and works in her found home of Winnipeg. And of course, our featured author, Michael Hutchinson, is Swampy Cree from the Treaty 5 area and a member of the Mississippi. Thank you so much. Cree Nation. He wrote the Mighty Muskrats Mystery series to educate young Canadians, build pride in First Nation and impoverished youth, and create a better Canadian and First Nations relationship. To tell us more, please join me in welcoming Michael Hutchinson. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being the host of the show.
Well, that means I get to talk first, not you.
Yes.
Not really. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak with you a little bit about this this book, The Case of the Movie Mayhem. I also just want to greet everybody on the socials. Hope you're all out there loving and eating spaghetti and drinking wine or something. Let's start with my many questions I have for you, Michael Hutchinson. Please, let's give some love to Michael. This is the sixth book in your series, the Mighty Muskrat. First, let's have you introduce who the Mighty Muskrats are.
Okay. Well, the Mighty Muskrats, in First Nation families, what often happens is kids of the same age group are lumped together. And so I grew up with some of my cousins in the same crib. Like we grew up, their birthday, we went to each other's birthdays, and everything like that. And so the Mighty Muskrats are a group of young people. They're probably between the ages of 10 and 13, and they're lumped together. And they started, solving mysteries on their reserve, and they're pretty precocious kids. The oldest is a Tim, which means dog in Cree. He's the tallest and the fastest runner and the big one, and so he sort of represents our physical self. And then there's Chickadee and Samuel, and they sort of flip back and forth between mental and emotional, and Chickadee's a computer whiz, and Samuel is sort of he's a bookworm, and then Otter is the smallest and the youngest, but he's also the one, his parents died in a car crash and he was much younger, and so he grew up with grandpa, and so he knows the most about his traditions and ceremony and all that kind of stuff. So they each have their own little place, and they each sort of interact in that way if you read the books.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't actually catch on to the fact that
There's
you
a whole
have,
bunch of weirdness in those
you know,
books that are just dropped in
you
there.
have physical, mental, emotional. That's great.
Yeah.
What adventure did we go on in the case of the movie Mayhem?
Well, Windy Lake is a fictional First Nation that, is it in the north? Is it in the south? I don't know, but they have a lot of different industry. And in this book, each book takes place in a different season. So this is a summer book, and they are a movie crew came to town, and they're filming a First Nation superhero movie, which is actually based on an adult novel that I've written but have never been able to get published.
In case there's a publisher watching.
Yes. And so, so the movie crew comes to town, and then one of the Jenny trucks and the prop truck go missing, and then the Mighty Muskrats are on the case. I used to work in catering and rock concerts and movie shoots back in the early 90s. And I made a lot of stupid mistakes on the movie set and stuff like that. And some of those mistakes have made it into the book.
Yes, I noticed. What kind of mistakes did you make on movie sets, Michael Hutchinson?
Well, I think
The block moving.
yeah, I think that was either Spirit Bear that I did with Herbie Barnes, or because I was working on two movies at the same time. I can't remember.
Name drop.
And then the other one was For the Moment by Russell Crowe. With Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe did a movie out here back in the early 90s with Christine Hurt about a World War I pilot who comes to Manhattan. So what happened was, so on movie sets, they have these little buckets of blocks. And they're everywhere. And I just started working on movie sets, so I didn't know what they were. And then one day I came, and I was working catering, so my job was to bring snacks around and stuff like that, right, for the crew. And I noticed, oh my goodness, someone spilled all these blocks all over the place. So I went and picked them all up and put them back in the pail. Now, what that's called is called blocking. And so when we're shooting something outside, you can't put you can't take a marker or tape and tape it to the ground. So they use little blocks to show the actors where they're supposed to go. And it's called blocking. And I didn't know that. And I went and picked up all the blocks and put them back into the pail. So the director was like, get that effing idiot out of here. And I was kind of kicked off the set for a couple of days. So.
Well, that wasn't embarrassing.
It was pretty embarrassing. If there's one thing in my life, it's that I'm not afraid to get embarrassed. Yes, I'll take the risk.
I know that. I know
Yes.
that very much. Yeah, that's true. This is the sixth book, right?
Yeah.
So you have these kids going and solving these mysteries in their community. But what got you started? Why did you want to write the Mighty Muskrats series?
Well, I've had a lot of different jobs, and recently a lot of those jobs have been in Indigenous media and politics. And so in media, as you know, you get a lot of the same questions over and over again. You get a lot of people asking about, how do First Nation people feel about, and so, I always say one of the saddest things about talking about First Nation issues is educating Canadians about Canada, right? Because, they have a perspective on Canada, but there's a whole different Canada that they might not realize is there. And so my hope was that if I write stories for the younger generation and educate them at a young age, then they'll have that knowledge throughout their adult life. And if these books reach enough young people and educate them, then one of the big lessons in the books, I guess, is that not all First Nation people think alike. So most of the stories have a main mystery story, but then underneath it, there's usually a secondary story that deals with First Nation issues. And a lot of times, that secondary story will contain two poles of First Nation thought. So like in the case of Windy Lake, which is often about environmental issues, their cousin protests the local mine and changes herself to the peer of the local mine, but they also meet a young gentleman who works at the mine. And so he's trying to be a good human being by providing for his family, by working at the mine. She's trying to be a good human being by protesting against it, but, well, they're both trying to be good their own way, and they have different views of thought, but that's part of it. We as First Nation people do not all think as one block.
I see what you did there. What is the lesson, the underlying lesson in this one? You have the case of the missing Jenny truck, of
Yeah.
course, which the Mighty Muskrats are out to solve.
Yeah.
But you have some interesting other storylines going.
Yeah, this one actually, a really hard secondary story didn't come together in this one, but there are some ideas that I wanted to relate, I guess. And one of them is, in our communities, when there's industry around our communities, and or even when our communities are on highways, there becomes an almost like Vegas type attitude by visitors. We can do whatever we want here because none of our family are here. What happens in the north stays in the north. And that sort of attitude to behavior around Indigenous communities and in remote areas, I would say. So that is kind of one idea. What that interaction, what happens in the north, and how that affects the locals, and then the attitude expressed by the outsiders, I guess. And then another idea that was just sort of dropped in there, but I've had some of the reviewers actually touch it. Is the bears going to the dump?
That is just everywhere in the north, right?
Well, yeah,
Let's go to the zoo. That's the dump.
If you go to a First Nation, that's hey, what do you guys do here? You want to go see the bears at the dump? And I've seen like bears sitting on couches.
Yeah, man.
Like
What's up?
Yeah. They're anyway, so going to see the bears at the dump is a big thing. So grandpa is a major elder and teacher in the stories, and he takes the kids to the dump and he talks to them about getting knocked off your scent, right? And so the dump for the bears isn't evil, but it is slowly removing them from their scent. And that is unhappy.
Bit of a metaphor there.
Metaphorical.
There's also a really little sort of gentle story in there about bullying.
Is it?
With the race and the guy gets beat
Yes,
up, Bug beats up. You don't even know your own Bug.
That's actually a major happening for the Mighty Muskrats because in no other book does one of the kids get assaulted.
Yeah.
But in this book, and there is that dynamics that happens anywhere, I guess, wherever there's families, there's older brothers and older cousins who might push younger brothers and younger cousins to do naughty stuff. And one of the bullies in town, gets one of his younger cousins to have a fight with one of the muskrats. And that was actually something that was also one of my youth experiences that I experienced. When I was in like grade 2, we had this boy in grade 3 who probably should have been grade 6. Anyway, he was a bit of a bully. His name was Donald, and one time he pushed my best friend down, and so I went running up and I jumped at him and knocked him down, and then I just realized, and then he stands up and and I'm like, oh poop, and so I was running around circles, and he was chasing me, and then I just kind of went, and he hit me and flew up in the air and landed in a pile over there, and then again he stood up, and then he kicked my ass, but yeah, that makes it look like.
I've done that too. That move where they're running after you and they're getting close, and then you scooch down real fast, and they go, ah! And then you get up the other way.
I call it the rabbit maneuver.
I call it the get the hell out of the way so you can get your ass beat maneuver.
Yeah.
Did you always intend to write this as a series?
Well, kinda. I sold it to my publisher as a First Nation hardwood, right? And so if you say First Nation hardwood books, you kind of gotta have books. And so yeah, the first one was I was shopping around that other book, the one that I mentioned that the movie is based on, and it wasn't going anywhere. But the person who was helping me do that said, "Hey, I just found out about this contest by Second Story Press, and they have an Indigenous contest every year, and I highly recommend you keep an eye out for it and join it if you can." And so, yeah, I won the contest that year, along with another author, I believe. And yeah, and then they just continued to support the Mighty Muskrats, and pretty excited about
Did
it.
you have like ideas beyond the first book, or were you like, oh shit, now I gotta write more?
Because of the politics and the First Nation things, there was a number of messages that I had that I wanted to get out, but not all of them had stories built around them yet. But there were concepts of I want to get this idea, I want to get this idea. The case of the burgled bundle was sort of something that was sticking with me because in 2007 the Cree National Gathering came to Mississippi, Grand Rapids, and there was this sort of conversation at that time. Grand Rapids, because of its importance to the fur trade, was really squeezed. They really wanted to assimilate my people, so there's like 8 churches on our res, and built
a dam,
and they built a great big dam over our falls, and so when the Cree National Gathering came, there was this conversation between communities that still had their traditions strong and those Cree communities who had lost their traditions, and there was this sort of we want you to teach us, and we still have to protect it, and so that kind of comes out in Burgled Bundle, and yeah, so there's.
You deal with some pretty serious subject matter in the Mighty Muskrat series, missing women, environmental issues, all of these issues. Were you ever concerned that young people might not be ready for those kinds of stories and messages?
I think.
Do we underestimate kids?
I think we underestimate kids. I think kids are they have to deal with the same realities that adults do. And when somebody dies in their family, no matter what age they are, they have to deal with that reality. And so, I don't believe in sort of dumbing things down for kids, but I do believe in being strategic in the information that you give them, and making certain that, yeah, it is appropriate for their age level and that sort of stuff. But having tough conversations, well, I think for kids, they feel trusted. If they feel that they're getting the honest opinion about an issue, then they feel that you as an adult are trusting them to have the wherewithal and the knowledge to deal with that. And kids always rise to the occasion, like they're the best of us.
Yeah, that's sort of thing to think, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Hardy Boys earlier, the Hardy Boys Indigenous version. Was that something that you were interested in as a child, the mystery books, the Hardy Boys?
Yeah. Well, my dad hated TV. And so he would sometimes remove it for it's spring. You'll see the TV back when you get the snow hits the ground. And so he would remove it for whole seasons. And so we read a lot. We lived on a piece of land about a 3-hour walk from town. So we couldn't just, head uptown. So we did read a lot. And the Hardy Boys were huge. Robert A. Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Jay Tolkien, all that kind of stuff. I grew up with that, and yeah, I was an avid reader. I was probably the only kid in my high school who could take out like 10 books at a time because the librarian knew that I'd read them all and then I'd bring them all back. I love my librarians. Librarians are awesome.
Were you out there solving mysteries in Mississippi?
No. Like many, I grew up in the area. We grew up across the river from the reserve, actually, and And then, when I was still very young, we moved away. We lived in Gentpeg. We lived in the Lactavani area, was where I graduated high school. And so, I've done a ton of jobs, and a lot of those kind of make it into the books.
So then what attracted you to writing this particular genre of, young adult mystery books? Why this genre?
Well, mysteries are all about dripping information, right? And that's exactly what I'm doing, not only with the First Nation issues part of it, but also, and so you get to pull the reader along, you grow the information kind of, and so for my purpose was to drop information, so a mystery just kind of, it just works. It just blends itself to that. And yeah, I always like the Mighty Muskrat books, and yes, I have all these. I've always liked the hardwood books, and Encyclopedia Brown, the Three Investigators. There was Alfred Hitchcock created these books, Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators, and the bus fort in the Mighty Muskrats bus
best fort ever.
is actually an homage to the Three Investigators fort.
Like, I want that fort.
It's a pretty cool fort.
It's very cool.
It's
very cool.
When I was a kid, we had an old bombardier on my grandpa's property, and so that was our fort. Was this old bombardier? I could still smell it, the wood and the oil and the grease. Like, there's a particular smell to bombardiers, and it always comes back to memories. But for the homage portion, they open up the back of the bombardier where the engine should be, and there's a tunnel, and they go through the tunnel, and on the other side of the tunnel, hidden in a stack of junkyard, is a school bus. So you go through the bombardier, which already looks like a cool fort, but then you go through and there's a school bus, which is made out to be even cooler.
Yeah, they have furniture in there, and a computer, Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Dang, I want this fort.
Well, one thing that's never said, but the muskrats are stealing electricity.
Well, they're borrowing electricity from hydro, which owes us a lot of money.
Yeah, they just kind of run the extension cord to the nearest outlet, so. But they only have a computer hooked up.
Land back via electricity.
Yeah.
The other really striking thing, of course, about your series is all Indigenous people. It takes place on reserve. You have res humor. You have, all the things like the lip pointing and the and these kids are Indigenous. They're smart. They're ballsy, and it's really, as somebody who grew up reading the Hardy Boys as well and all of those mysteries, why was it important for you to have them be Indigenous kids originally?
Well, those kids are my cousins in a lot of ways. And like I said, in Indigenous families, we're all grouped together. And so a lot of the jokes that are told are jokes that we told, the same res humor that you go to different reses. One of the muskrats, her name is Chickadee. And, almost every reserve that I go to, there's a girl named Chickadee. Yeah, so that was really important. And, it's kind of funny, like when in case of Windy Lake, Otter by himself goes on about a 4-hour canoe ride, and he's like 10, 11. And my editors didn't have a problem with that. But in the case of the missing auntie, they go uptown. Their auntie lives in the suburb, and they go downtown on a bus. And my editors were like, should they really be going by themselves on a bus? They're only 10, 13. And I'm like, you guys just let Otter by himself go on a 4-hour canoe ride.
But he's an Indian.
But you're worried about him, but and that's it. That's perspective. We're all finite beings, and everybody has their own perspective. And they knew the dangers of a bus ride downtown. They didn't maybe necessarily know the dangers of a 4-hour canoe ride.
Yeah, maybe. But why is it important for Indigenous kids to see themselves in books like this?
Well,
I mean, we certainly do.
No, you know, my heroes growing up were Sammy Davis Jr., you know, Robert Hume, right? Because he was a funny, non-white dude,
Mhm.
right? And then after that, it was Chief Dan George and Jim Compton. Right? Like seeing Jim Compton on CBC
With those
doing the
braids?
news with his
Girl.
braids,
Yeah, yeah.
like for me, that was like, yeah. So I always thank Jim whenever I see it, at least once a year. Thanks, you know. Yeah, and so representation is important, and seeing yourself, and you know, I have a lot of teachers giving me feedback, and that's one thing that they say is actually down, I think down in the States, there's one community in the States, Rocky Boy, Montana. Big Bear's son, when he fled, he went down to the States. And a teacher down there said she was unpacking the books and she told the kid, you know, oh, these characters are Cree. And the kid said, Cree like me? Oh. Yeah, and as an author, you know, that's just like,
Right?
it's you right there.
I love that. What does
Yeah.
that mean to you to hear that?
Yeah. Oh, I want to get a t-shirt that says Cree like me. You know?
Hell yeah. We'll invest in that.
Yeah. And just to know that you're having an impact on young people. You know, I've always been a big brother. My younger siblings will say I'm still too much of a big brother, but that's just the way I think, I guess.
Mm. You mentioned earlier that the other thing you like to do in this book series is to tuck in little things, you know, little lessons, little teachings. And in this book, you talked about the drum, the Dene drum and the Cree drum, and the different tricksters. Why is that important for you to tuck in those lessons?
Uh, well, it's you know, I think there is a general knowledge about First Nation beliefs, but there's some really interesting things about First Nation beliefs. And I also think, you know, like we didn't have telescopes or microscopes and that sort of stuff, but we were human beings, and so we were naturally studiers and scientists. And so psychology, you know, if you look at our trickster stories, and a lot of our sacred stories, they can be unfolded depending on the age group that you're talking to. So if you're talking to a young group, it's a funny story about Nanabush picking butts of the scabs off his butt and eating them. But as you tell that to a different age group, it has a different meaning. And then, you know, there's a sacred meaning at the very top of that. So our legends can be unfolded depending on the age group, and a lot of that is psychology. You know, like the trickster acts so weird because he is humanity, and so he doesn't only do normal things; he does the crazy stuff that humans do on the extremes.
And finally, what is your hope for the series? Are we looking at like a TV series?
Well, the Muskrats were purchased by a production company at one time, but that production company was working on bigger projects and ended up not doing anything with them. So Second Story Press and myself still have the production rights to the Muskrats, and they were returned to us after the contract ended. So if there's anybody out there who would like to make a TV series or a cartoon, it would be a great cartoon series.
Mm-hmm.
You remember Adventures in Rainbow Country?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
See, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Is an Adventures in Rainbow Country.
Scooby-Doo game.
Well, Scooby-Doo is all right.
It's all right. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Yeah.
We're going to now hear a reading
Sure.
from the case of the Movie Mayhem. Somebody out here switching the cameras? Should I be pointing? Jigging? What's happening? All right. Michael Hutchinson.
All righty. Okay, this is, I just opened it to this, so I might as well read it. This is the beginning of the second chapter, and I'll just read a few quick pages. Chapter 2, Drone Attack. It's coming right at us. The scream rang out just as the drone zoomed over the powwow. With their regalia sparkling in the sunlight, some attendees continued to complete the circle. Others herded together, startled by the angry buzz. The young men in the center of the gathering, their attention captured by the flying machine, weakly stepped to the rhythm of the drum. Clothed in their beaded ceremonial wear, Chickadee and Otter had been watching the powwow from the shade of Windy Lake's arbor. Since first hearing about the filming at Windy Lake, they hoped extras might be needed, and they were, for the powwow scene. Now the two cousins studied the drone. When it's buzzing near, Chickadee grabbed Otter, bearing her head in his shoulder. Don't let it see me. 20 long steps outside the long frame arbor, Tim and Samuel leaned out the window of the little shed that served as a canteen. Tim whistled. It will see everybody. Sam shielded his eyes from the sun as he stepped out. I think that's the point. That's a top-of-the-line drone. Behind the canteen, a fleet of snow-white cube trucks and vans were scattered around the grounds. Due to the cost of delaying filming, and with the Jenny truck still missing, the director had rearranged the shooting schedule around the need for mobile electricity and shots of the hard-to-replace props. Having grown up in the city, Tim and Sam were unsure of their ability to join the powwow dancers and drummers. Instead, Mavis had recruited them to run the craft service. Excuse me. Using the arbor's canteen as snack storage, they had split the work. Tim was doing most of the heavy lifting and restocking, while Sam greeted the movie crew and took any orders for hot food back to Mavis in the food truck. Over the pounding of the drums, the sound system crackled. The announcer's voice boomed over the crowd. The volume of the murmur indicated the man was leaning too close to the microphone. There was a loud thump, some whispered cursing, and then muffled voices. The drummer stopped, then the dancers. Sam shook his head. What's this joker going to say? There was a burst of loud static, and then, ladies and gentlemen, you all look like a nest of hungry birds with your mouths all hung open. The movie folks want a drone shot of a natural powwow. Y'all ain't acting natural. Bunch of stunned baby birds looking at a flying camera. People burst out laughing. The powwow MC allowed a moment for the joke to ripple through the crowd. Then his chuckle rumbled from the speakers. From here, all I see is chins. Baby birds, hookah, hey, let's get down to powwow. A rumble from the big drums signaled agreement. Under the arbor, the people wrapped up their giggles. As the singers' voices pierced the air, the young men in the center of the arbor began to dance in earnest. Smiling, Chickadee let go of Otter, then looked for Sam and Tim at the snack bar, her knuckles wrapped on Otter's beaded vest. Don't look at the drone. Let's go find those two. Otter followed his cousin to the main entrance of the arbor. Overhead, the flying camera still buzzed, but now everyone at the powwow knew it wasn't cool to watch it, so they didn't.
That story actually happened. It's called.
It's made by Hallmark. It's something story. It's a Hallmark movie. It tells different legends across the country. It's really good CGI. But they filmed the powwow scene at the Blood Tribe Arbor in Alberta, and it's a great big arbor made out of telephone poles. So it's this huge arbor. The movie crew was there. They were having a powwow. Blood Tribe is a big tribe. Blood people are very tall First Nation people. Like they could all play basketball. They're very tall people. And but anyway, they had a helicopter flying over to get a picture of the circle of people dancing in the powwow, and everybody was watching the helicopter. All they got was pictures of everybody looking up at the camera. And anyway, so they had to warn everybody, please do not look at the helicopter as it flies over the powwow. I don't know where to anyway, but is there anybody who would like to answer questions from the crowd?
Questions? Oh, question over here.
Hi, Michael. Do you do any work in school classrooms?
I do. Yeah, if there's any teachers out there online, you can email me or email Second Story Press, and they will give you my contact information. And I do speak to schools quite often. And I also work for the Manitoba First Nation Education Resource Center. And, I have to brag about the MFNERC a little bit. We're probably the largest First Nation organization in the country. And when you include the school system in there. And we're mandated to do cultural revitalization and language, and I'm in charge of the publishing department. And so Well, my partner Amber does a lot of the work to make certain that we put up books in the languages and stuff like that. So I'm in the schools in a number of ways, I guess. But yeah, like I said earlier, the kids are the best of us. Uh-oh, my daughter's going to ask a question.
That's your daughter?
These
My
two right here,
gosh.
yeah.
I haven't seen you since, I'm old, never mind. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
They got big.
Do you ever think that you're gonna age up the Mighty Muskrats? And if so, do you think you're gonna have them tackle more like personal issues to themselves, like gender, sexuality, and like more unraveled stories?
Oh, what a great question.
Yeah.
Dang.
My daughter just said sexuality.
Oh, no. That's sensitive.
Yeah, well, yeah, you know,
Wait, he's blushing now. He's like, I don't know how to deal with this.
yeah, I'm in a perfect world, I'd like to get the Mighty Muskrats to 10 books, and then maybe do another, you know, I would like to do them in the high school years, and then maybe in the college years, and have each of the muskrats, you know, go different ways. You know, for example, Otter, you know, some of those that are our most spiritual ones sometimes fall the deepest into the challenges some of our people face. And, you know, and so, yeah, I would like to do that. Continue talking about Indigenous issues on a older level, I guess, and sort of carry people through the process. I am writing a book right now called Niche 22. I don't know if anybody's ever read Catch 22, Joseph Heller, he's one of my favorite authors. And this story is about, I don't know if you know this, but if the Hotel Fort Garry has about 4 basements underneath it, and the bottom basement, there's a tunnel that goes from the Fort Garry to the steam plant in the forts, where 8 Channel used to be, right? They're all in a straight line. The steam plant used to feed the train station and then the Hotel Fort Garry. And so there's a tunnel under there. It's blocked off now. But in Niche 22, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek book, they do a grand exit. And the elders march the Minister of Indian Affairs down into the basement through the tunnel, and they kidnap the Minister of Indian Affairs. And so the book isn't really necessarily about what the elders do with the minister, which is just take them back to their First Nation to show the conditions there, but how everybody reacts to that. And so if you've read Catch 22, it's very tongue-in-cheek and very kind of sarcastic, and actually get a t-shirt that says that, tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic.
Any other questions? Got one in the back?
Just curious, which Indian Affairs Minister?
The worst one.
I haven't, it's not a real person, but his name is a combination of I don't know if you've ever heard of Hayter Reed. Hayter Reed, back in the old Indian agent days, they actually got Canadian bureaucrats one time to vote on who was the worst of them. And Hayter Reed won. And he was an old Indian agent who did just some crazy things with First Nation people. And, you know, back in those days, you know, the social experimentation, you know, like, you know, and what they were doing. And, yeah, so part of his name, his first name is Hayter, anyway, Hyter. But if you ever get a chance to look into Hayter Reed, he's quite the guy. They used to, Indian agents used to arrange weddings and stuff like that. So, you know, one of probably the worst case was, it was called the File Hills Colony, where they basically took a First Nation, said, okay, you regular Indians, and they took off half their land and started this sort of agricultural colony with the good Indians, and they even arranged marriages and stuff like that of people in there. It was a social experiment run by Indian agents.
My vote would be Duncan Campbell Scott.
Duncan Campbell Scott was actually the guy in charge of File Hills.
Exactly.
Yes.
Any other questions? Mayangan, you're late.
Yes.
Was that about the book?
Yeah.
But you missed all the conversation about the book, bro.
For those that don't know, me and Ro and Megan, we're all part of the Indigenous Writers Collective here in Winnipeg, and I believe Ro's the first incarnation, and we're sort of second or third.
No, we were the second,
Oh,
Jordan
okay.
Wheeler, and
Okay.
he was the first. He likes to tell people that.
Yes, okay,
If he's
sorry.
watching, I got.
Yeah, yeah.
So, we were the second.
Yeah.
All right,
So this is part of my support group, and I want to thank them for it. Part of the reason the Mighty Muskrats were written was because of the Indigenous Writers Collective and the support that I got through that. So to all the young authors out there, well, I guess we might as well wrap up with this, I guess.
Absolutely.
What I usually tell young people when they ask me, how do I write something? I usually say, first thing you do is read. Read. Because, that board that painters hold that have all their colors on them. So when you read, what you're doing is you're filling your brain, your palate. You're filling your brain with sentences you like. You're filling it with sentences you don't like, paragraphs you like, characters you don't like. But you're putting that all back there. So the first thing is to read. The second thing is to write. Writers write. So sit down and write. And what I would suggest is, once or twice a week, you put on a timer, put it on for 5 minutes, and for those 5 minutes, you do nothing but write. Whether it's a poem, short story, outline of a short story, whatever, for those 5 minutes, write, and then you slowly make that time bigger and more frequent, and then eventually you're going to be writing for an hour, every second day. I don't. I ignore my family at specific times, but eventually you get to a point where you can write for long periods of time and you just sit down and write. And then the third thing I always say is find an editor. An editor is somebody who you trust, somebody that you know what they're trying to do with the piece, and somebody you're not going to get defensive in front of. And you could have the greatest ideas in your head, but if you don't successfully get them onto the paper or in the computer, they're lost. And so an editor will tell you, hey, you describe this character here, but what are they wearing? Or you describe this chain of logic, this chain of ideas over here, but this one brick in the middle, I'm a little bit fuzzy on. Can you strengthen that brick? And so that's what an editor does. They're your first reader. And so, yeah, read, write, find an editor, and then if you're lucky, you can find a support group like these guys that'll help you get the confidence to write.
Perhaps another last question would be, why should Indigenous people write?
Well, on a worldview level, our purpose in here is to make our lives into a good story. Our purpose in life is to transfer information to the next generation in a good way so that they can live their life. So storytelling is the basis of a good life. Trying to make your life into a good story. And that's why, our ancestors, talk about a good day to die and that sort of stuff, where it's like, I want my life to have meaning and end in a way that is epic, I guess you could say. So that's on that level. But on a bottom level, like I said earlier, there is a truth to Canada. There is a truth about what Canada is. And if you're in mainstream Canada, you might not see the edges of Canada. And so what we need is storytellers to tell us about those places we don't get to visit, those people we don't get to meet, and those stories we don't get to live. And yeah, that's what writers do.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Michael.
We'll move on to the signing portion of the evening, which will take place at the table to my right. Feel free to have a copy of your book signed before you visit the cash desk. And then thank you again for being here, Michael Hutchinson. Let's give another round of applause. And of course, to Rosanna Deerchild for hosting, and to the Secretary of Press for making this happen. Thank you, everyone.